Good Monday morning to all of you. I'm Danilo Evangelista. Hope you guys are all having a good day so far. As I promised, I said I would do a predictions video on what I believe this hurricane season would be like. Just my thoughts in this video, not trying to claim anything official. But I'm going to share my thoughts, including, of course, the factors that I'm looking for this hurricane season, and of course, at the very end, my own predictions. And that does include landfall predictions as well. I do have some of those. So if you're not looking forward to that, or if you have anything against that, I suggest that you do click away right now instead of wasting the time um, talking about why you think landfall predictions aren't good. I'm doing them anyways, and I don't care if you don't think that I should do them. Whatever, that's just your opinion. But I'm going to do them anyways, and I hope you guys all enjoy and let me know what you think. So, with that being said, let's get started. First off, in a review of what last year's hurricane season was like, it was a very active hurricane season indeed, despite the fact that we had an El Nino in place for one, and also two, there were also not a lot of landfalls in the United States. There were a few, but we had 20 named storms, 7 hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes, and we only had 1 U.S. hurricane landfall, and that was Idalia. And the ACE index too was also above normal at 145. So last year was indeed an above normal year, at least in terms of activity standpoint, though we didn't have a lot of impacts. But that was last year. And very interesting, of course, last year too occurred in an El Nino year. But what about this year? So that's what we're going to go into in this video. But first of all, before we get to that, we got to look at what the factors are in an Atlantic hurricane season. What do we look for when it comes to predicting a hurricane season? And the most important thing that I think is up there when it comes to the Atlantic specifically is the sea surface temperatures, specifically that we're going to look at here, the sea surface temperature anomalies. They give us an idea of what the setup is atmospherically in the Atlantic, besides, of course, tracking in real time. Another very important factor is ENSO, a factor that we talk about very often too, El Nino, La Nina. That is also a huge player into a hurricane season, though sometimes it does not always mean as much when it comes to activity or inactivity. Again, case proven last year. Wind shear too, although this is kind of a, I don't know how to say it, kind of a direct effect of ENSO, El Nino, and La Nina. That's what wind shear is somewhat of a product of, or at least it partially is, as well as the MJO. But these are all very important factors nonetheless, and those are factors that we're going to be looking at often throughout the video. So first off, I want to talk about with what everybody is predicting so far, bearing in mind all these factors. And it's quite impressive to me how everybody has predicted such a very active hurricane season so far. I mean, even since the first prediction released back in December from Tropical Storm Risk, they went with 20 named storms. And in fact, this was the most aggressive December prediction that Tropical Storm Risk ever released. And of course, it would only be fitting for months later for CSU to release their most aggressive April forecast ever, and that is with 23 named storms, 11 hurricanes, and 5 majors. So very aggressive. And then just look at all the predictions after that, and everybody else basically followed in the same suit in showing the potential for this year to be a very active hurricane season. Everybody's agreeing on it, but why are they agreeing that this year could be such an active hurricane season? Well, that brings us to what makes an active hurricane season. What are the factors that we look at when it comes to determining whether a season will be active or inactive? And one thing that is very important, as I mentioned before, sea surface temperature anomalies. In an active season, they're usually warmer than normal. In this year's case, and we'll look at that in a moment, in this year's case, they are record warm. While in an inactive year, we tend to have cooler than normal sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic. There's also rising motion too because of those very warm sea surface temperature anomalies, while on the flip side, there is sinking motion overall in the Atlantic, and rising motion and sinking motion in terms of how the air is behaving in the atmosphere. So rising motion would mean the air is rising and thunderstorms are being created, and that means more favorable and more more favorable conditions for thunderstorms to occur, which could then lead to development of tropical systems in the Atlantic. So that's a very big one. That kind of ties into MJO too, as well as sea surface temperature anomalies. But this is a very big thing, and that is there is no El Nino present in an active hurricane season. However, last year was an exception in that there was an El Nino present, but because of that, but despite that, we still had an active hurricane season, and that actually played into the fact that sea surface temperature anomalies were very warm last year. Because usually in an El Nino year, we tend to have inactive hurricane seasons in the Atlantic, but obviously last year, of course, was an exception, and that usually plays into wind shear as well. In an El Nino year, we tend to have higher wind shear in the Atlantic. Last year, we didn't have as much wind shear, which is why it was active. But typically, in an active season, we have lower wind shear because typically there is no El Nino in an active season, and usually when we don't have El Ninos, conditions in terms of wind shear tend to be a lot more favorable. And lastly, dry air levels, and this is still variable because the Atlantic could be dry even in a La Nina year or even in a year that's not an El Nino, and even with warm sea surface temperature anomalies, the Atlantic could be dry. So this is more variable, but usually when it comes to development themselves of tropical systems, we look for lower dry air levels, while in active years, we had a lot of dry air throughout the entirety of the season, which is why we saw those years inhibited in terms of having super active seasons. But when it comes to how they are this year in terms of the factors, first off, here's the Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies. Very, very warm. They've remained warm, record warm also throughout the entire year. So far, quite incredible. And they're still very warm. Look at some of these anomalies, especially in the eastern Atlantic, 2 to even 3 degrees Celsius solidly above normal in some areas, and quite incredible because the Atlantic tropics on average, in terms of sea surface temperature anomalies, are still 1 degree Celsius above normal on average, and it's been like that for the whole year too. So the Atlantic is just extraordinarily warm, so we can already cross this factor out in terms of that it favors an active season. And here, just to show you the current MDR plot too of what the average is in sea surface temperature anomalies. This map is by cyclonicweather.com, by the way, by Alex Borim. Really good site, has a lot of very useful tools. So of course, shout out to him. But here I'm going to show you the Atlantic has been very warm since the beginning of the year, since February. This only goes back to early January, but you could see we've basically been at or above this line 1 degree Celsius on average across the entire MDR. So this includes the Eastern Atlantic and the Caribbean too. We've been at that line since the beginning of the year, and we've only recently dipped because of an increase of Saharan air and trade winds, although there is some talk about whether or not this dip is actually what happened in actuality, some sort of satellite bias when it comes to collecting sea surface temperature anomaly data. But either way, we're still very warm, and we are also rebounding in terms of sea surface temperature anomalies too. So bottom line, the Atlantic is very warm and very primed in that aspect for the hurricane season this year. Another factor is ENSO, El Nino and La Nina. As you can see in the Pacific right now, we're kind of warm. We were just coming off an El Nino, a very strong one at that, from this past winter and from last year too. As I mentioned before, last year was an El Nino year, but the thing is that we still had an active hurricane season, and that's because last year as well, we had very near record warm sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic, which is what helped kept the Atlantic active despite the fact we had an El Nino. This year, on the flip side, that is going away, and you can already see it too. I'll also show you the ENSO plots by the El Nino, and you can see since the beginning of the year, that as well has been on the decline rapidly. Look at this from February. Early February, we were all the way at 1.8, 1.9 Celsius, so we were at a very strong El Nino, and now down to where we are in mid-April, we're below 1 degree Celsius So we're below the line that we even consider a moderate El Nino when it comes to the Nino 3.4, and we're now only at 0.9 Celsius, which is a weak El Nino. And so we've really weakened in terms of the warmth in the Pacific, and that is only expected to continue over the next several months, because this is what the predictions are for El Nino in terms of what is expected in the future. Look at this, all the models. This is first off the CFS version 2. From now up until the hurricane season, and by the time it gets to the even next year too, we dip all the way down. We go from 1 Celsius where we are now, and we dip all the way down into La Nina territory, and very potent La Nina territory at that too. The CFS brings this Nina all the way down to a negative 1.5. So that is actually a pretty strong La Nina as well, right off the heels of a very strong El Nino that we had this past winter. And if we take a look at the CPC, this is the CPC prediction of La Nina, and you can see almost a 70% chance expected by the time we get to later on in the year. So the confidence is there that there will be some sort of La Nina in place, but most importantly, there will be no El Nino at all this season. I mean, you could just take a look at the El Nino chances, and they are less than 10%. So that means very high confidence there will be no El Nino for this season. And in fact, on the flip side, we could get a La Nina. So that means another factor that is very important to the Atlantic in favor of an active hurricane season this year. The third factor, wind shear. And this is, as I said, very much influenced by El Nino and La Nina. And this is why we typically do not get El Nino and active hurricane seasons, because in an El Nino year, the Pacific is warmer, obviously, but that leads to stronger wind shear in the Atlantic because of greater atmospheric stability, because of all of the moisture being robbed and centered in the Pacific. And of course, because of that, because of the rising motion in the Pacific, we tend to have that spillover as strong upper level westerly winds in the atmosphere in the Atlantic, and that leads to wind shear, which leads to less active hurricane seasons in an El Nino. So that's an El Nino. But what about La Nina? And this is when we see more activity, because the Pacific tends to be cooler, drier as well. That helps lead to instability to focus in the Atlantic, and that's when we get less wind shear to occur as well, which is why we typically look at La Nina to be the more favorable sort of ENSO state, especially when it comes to wind shear, and that also leads to an active hurricane season as well. And factor 4, MJO, that is also very heavily influenced by El Nino and La Nina. And as I could show you, in La Nina conditions, Pacific tends to be drier, so that means MJO, which, by the way, if you're not sure what MJO is, it's basically short for the Madden-Julian oscillation, and that kind of determines this oscillation, this index determines where rising motion is, where there's rising motion in the atmosphere in the world. And typically in La Nina years, MJO tends to be focused in the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean, which tends to be the most favorable for active hurricane seasons as well. And we have sinking air in the Pacific. And in El Nino conditions, obviously, that is the opposite. We have rising motion focused in the Pacific, and therefore we have sinking air in the Atlantic. And obviously, that is not very favorable for an active hurricane season. So what about the MJO forecast for this year? Actually, first of all, just want to compare really quickly Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies to how they were in past years. And this is just really an alarming signal, honestly, when it comes to what it means for this year, because this is the Atlantic this year, and these other 3 years are 3 of the most recent very active hurricane seasons in the Atlantic. So we're starting off with this year, and we all see just how many oranges and reds we see all throughout, especially the deep tropics in the Atlantic. First off, let's compare that to 2020, a year that was in the pandemic, we all know that, but a year that produced 30 named storms in the Atlantic, record in terms of how many named storms we've had in a single year, record amount of activity in 2020. Not even close. This is honestly alarming. Not even close. The Atlantic, we've had all these oranges and reds throughout the deep tropics, and we still have some of those oranges, and the Atlantic was still pretty warm, but not even close in comparison to this year. It's honestly, if you were to put 2020 and 2024 in a boxing match, it would just take one punch for 2024 in order to beat 2020. That's how far they are apart from each other. So really, it is an alarming signal. If this year, 2020, with this look, was able to produce 30 named storms, just what in the heck will 2024 produce? And that's just a question that a lot of people have when it comes to this hurricane season. And it's a real question. It's not a hype question. It's a real question, especially given sea surface temperature anomalies have a lot of influence on how the Atlantic is atmospherically. In 2017 too, this was another very big year. We had Harvey, Irma, Maria, some very notable storms from that year. And look at that, not even close as well. In fact, this is even further than 2020 was. We were just starting to warm up in the Atlantic and the MDR in April. So it is a little bit of an unfair comparison, but between now in 2024 and this time in 2017, we are also well ahead of the game in terms of sea surface temperature anomalies too. So by now, since we have two really active hurricane seasons that this year is outbeating in terms of sea surface temperature anomalies, that should suggest a really active hurricane season, right? Well, we also have another one, and this is really, I guess you could call it the icing on the cake when it comes to just looking at the comparisons between this year and years past and seeing how they compare in sea surface temperature anomalies. This is 2005, and I'm pretty sure most people know, at least in the hurricane tracking world, just what kind of a year 2005 was. We had storms like Katrina, Rita, Wilma. That year was a really bad year. And not even this year compares that well. Not even 2005 compares on the level that this year is. So 3 really active hurricane seasons that we've had, and they are all not as warm as what we are this year. So that is something very interesting indeed. And let's actually expand that to not only the 3 most active hurricane seasons over the last several years, but all of the active hurricane seasons that we've had since we began this warm Atlantic state in the mid 90s, a positive AMO state. A lot of people talk about that. We've been in a positive AMO since the mid 90s, and that basically means a lot of very warm waters centered over the deep tropics of the Atlantic. And this is an average from March, from all of those really active years since 1995, and 1995 was actually one of those really active years. And this is what they average at in the Atlantic. And compare that to March of this year, we fall right in line, especially with how the configuration is. We have a lot of very warm water off Greenland, just south of Greenland, a colder in general subtropics, especially compared to a very, very warm deep tropics and MDR. Just look at that. And look at that this year too. We are far ahead of as well of all these other years averaged out. And we still have a very warm Atlantic, even warmer than all of these years on average. So the puzzle pieces, you could say, line up very well, and that should be suggestive of potentially a very active hurricane season. And I could show you that too, not only just with active hurricane seasons since the mid 90s, but this is also an active hurricane season correlation. This, in terms of sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic, how does it correlate when it comes to very warm sea surface temperature anomalies, and most importantly, their placement too, because we could have a warm Atlantic, but if it's all stretched out and the warmth is everywhere, that won't always lead to an active hurricane season. We tend to especially look at the sea surface temperature anomalies to be warmest and most concentrated in the eastern Atlantic and in the deep tropics too. And this year, let's go back to this year. Actually, no, we went ahead. But going back just a little bit, we'll go ahead in just a moment, don't worry. But going back in just a little bit, notice too, this is this year, And this is how this year lines up, and this is how all these other past years lined up too. And look at the correlation to an active hurricane season. Lines up very well, doesn't it? We have a very warm patch of waters just off the eastern Atlantic, the Canary Current, which is very much present this year. You can see that, and also in these active years too. And plus, we also have very warm sea surface temperature anomalies all throughout the deep tropics of the Atlantic, also in line with what this year has so far. So very well in correlation with really active hurricane season. So there you go. Another factor that should align with what could be a really active season. And then also MJO. This is another important thing. Very important, as we mentioned before. A lot of these years, especially that were very active, all had La Nina years, or most of them, not all of them, but most of them had La Nina years. But if you look back at the map that I showed you for La Nina when we talked about MJO, you notice sinking air in the Pacific. And what do you know? That's what we have in this graph too. Sinking air in the Pacific, and that leads to rising air in the Atlantic and rising air in the Indian Ocean as well. And that is very much in line with what these really active hurricane seasons have had so far. And how does that compare to what the forecast is for this year? I mean, it's kind of cut off a little bit, but this is the CFS forecast. And look at this. I'm just going to compare the two really quickly. This is what the active hurricane seasons have had. This is what it typically looks like in terms of MJO in a really active hurricane season. And this is this year. Very much almost a perfect match in terms of what we would look at when it comes to MJO. All of these browns and oranges centered right in the Pacific, so that means sinking air in the Pacific, and that in turn leads to rising air in the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic. And the Indian Ocean part is also very important because that tends to help energize the West African monsoon, which is where we see all of our tropical waves originate. And if you're not aware what tropical waves are, they're these pulses of energy that move westward off the coast of Africa. And those tend to be the seedlings more oftentimes than not for the development that we see, especially of some of these really intense big name hurricanes that occur. They start from tropical waves, and a very active African monsoon means that there will be more of those tropical waves, and also those tropical waves will be more energized as well. And that in turn is because we have rising air not only in the Atlantic but also in the Indian Ocean as well. So that's why that is very important, and that is also another factor that is very important and also suggestive of maybe an active hurricane season, potentially very active as well. And of course, with wind shear as well, as I mentioned, lower wind shear is very important in the deep tropics. And what do you notice? A lot of blues across the deep tropics in the Atlantic. There are some of these oranges here, but this is more or less a signal. I would not really pay attention to a lot of this. This is more or less a symptom of the very strong West African monsoon because it is fueled by, in the upper levels, what we call the African easterly jet. And you can see that represented by a bunch of these arrows very swiftly moving to the east. You can see these arrows here that represents a very strong African easterly jet. And that's probably what this model with the CFS is seeing when it comes to wind shear. But overall, besides that, a lot of very low wind shear across the deep tropics, and that just goes to show as well, CFS obviously taking into account of the La Nina, and it's probably seeing that, and because of that, it's saying we'll have very low wind shear throughout the deep tropics, and that leads to another factor that is in favor for this year to potentially be an active hurricane season. Now comes to the part that a lot of people really like paying attention to the most because, well, it impacts us. It's the biggest factor that really impacts us, and that is most active landfalls in terms of steering, most active years when it comes to landfalls, I should say. That is really the part that everybody tries to pinpoint, and a lot of people sometimes advise against trying to make assumptions about steering patterns, especially this far out since it's April. but I still think it is somewhat worth it to look at it anyways. And these are the most active landfall years since we began this active era in 1995. Obviously, we had years like 2017, 2020, and obviously 2004 and 2005. This is an average of all of those years. And you notice there is a very big ridge near southeastern Canada, near Atlantic Canada, and in the northeastern United States. And then we kind of also have this big ridge bridge across the northern portion of the Atlantic too. And how does that compare to what the models are forecasting for this year? This is what it shows. This is 3 models, not just one, because before we only had the CFS, but this is the CFS, CanSIBS, and this other model too, which is the C3S model ensemble. This is actually more or less a model ensemble of a bunch of models combined, including models like the CFS and the Euro 2. Look at all these. Look at what all 3 of these models are showing. And one thing you notice, they all have this big ridge over southeastern Canada and the northeast. Look at that. And they also have some sort of ridge bridge too. Not perfect, and obviously the models can't exactly pinpoint the pattern perfectly, but they all seem to have, and they all seem to show a very perfect, or a very much in line. Let's go back to this map of the very active landfall years. The models here, this is what they show for the active landfall years, and let's go back to what the models show this year. They match up pretty well, and I think you could see that with your 2 eyes. We all have 2 eyes, or I think or at least I assume that we all do. And you can see they all line up very well with a very active ridge pattern, in terms of a ridge pattern that looks favorable for landfalls. They line up pretty well, and that doesn't mean that we will get a very active landfall season, but it is really useful to look at past years, analog years that we like to look at, that we like to compare to, because that can be helpful, because, the saying, history can repeat itself. It often does, and sometimes looking at these models kind of gives us an idea of, will history repeat itself this year, which is why I think climate models are very much necessary when it comes to long-range hurricane season predicting. And they're also a tool that we have that we should be taking advantage of. And all the climate models this year, or at least all the major ones, show, in terms of ridging, it lines up very well when it comes to years that were not only active, but also had a lot of landfalls as well. Really quickly, what about Saharan air? And I bring up Saharan air because it is a factor that a lot of people talk about. I've seen quite a few things about it recently online as well. But I do want to bring another perspective to it, because a lot of the times when people talk about Saharan air, it is a form of dry air that does move off the coast of Africa from the Saharan desert. And it does often impact the Atlantic when it comes to tropical cyclone development. However, I really want to point out that Saharan air is not a huge factor when it comes to determining how active a hurricane season will be overall, whether we have a lot of Saharan air or whether we don't have a lot of Saharan air. And that is because typically in a year, climatology-wise, Saharan air, it tends to occur the most in the early season, in the early season months, in May, June, and July. That's when we tend to see the peak of Saharan air occur in the Atlantic. And those months are not the most active when it comes to Atlantic development. And the Saharan air layer usually inhibits activity, especially in the MDR. And if you know climatology, we typically don't get a lot of development to occur in the eastern part of the Atlantic anyways, in the early months of May, June, and July. We could get activity out there, and we have had activity in the MDR in the early months of the season. Especially last year, we had 2 MDR storms in June, but it doesn't always happen. It's not really part of climatology. And either way, Saharan air tends to be high in that part of the year anyways. And most of the time, it goes away by the time we get to August 20th when the peak season typically begins. Saharan air usually almost always goes away. And in response to that, the Atlantic, even if there's a lot of Saharan air sometimes in a season, the Atlantic does tend to get active. And that brings me to my other point about Saharan air. Even the most active hurricane seasons have had huge Saharan air outbreaks, especially in the early season. If you remember 2020 was apparently a record year when it came to Saharan air outbreaks. We had a record strong Saharan air outbreak in June, yet we still saw 30 named storms in 2020. So this really should prove, and also another year like 2005 as well. I also read that there was another very strong Saharan air outbreak in 2005 too, in June. And what do we have that very next month in July of 2005? We had Dennis and Emily, two very strong hurricanes in the Caribbean, and they formed in the MDR in July. And plus, Emily was the only July Category 5 we've ever recorded in the Atlantic too. So this really should go to show what I'm trying to prove here is, if you're getting with me, if you're trying to understand what I'm saying, is that Saharan air is not a really big factor when it comes to determining the overall outcome of a hurricane season. Yes, it has played into past years. It has played as part of the reason why past years weren't able to be as active as they were, but it's not a huge factor when it comes to the hurricane season, and that should be taken into consideration, especially once we do get Saharan air this hurricane season, because we will. It is part of climatology. It does happen, and I'm pretty sure we will get it at some point, especially between May, June, and July. So do not be baffled or flabbergasted when we do get it, because we will get it. And just telling you right now, it does not really mean that much for overall hurricane season activity, because it does go away at some point, and the storms eventually do come as well. So with that being said, given we've gone over everything we possibly could, well, maybe not everything, but most of the very important factors that we could in a hurricane season, what do I predict as a result? Drum roll really quickly if you're going to do a drum roll. And here's my predictions, my preliminary predictions for the hurricane season: 19 to 25 named storms, 8 to 12 hurricanes, and 4 to 6 major hurricanes. Again, not really that surprising, and very much in line with what everybody else is predicting, and what basically you can look at every single prediction that we've seen so far, and it aligns perfectly with what everybody is predicting, and an ACE index of 160 to 220 ACE points, also in line with what basically everybody else is saying too. So that is my number predictions. What about, and this is really where the part that I think could get me in huge trouble, especially on Twitter, what about what I think for landfall predictions as well? Well, these are my landfall hotspots too. These are, again, not trying to scare people. I'm not trying to scare people. I'm not trying to fearmonger. I'm not trying to tell everybody to be shivering on their knees as we head into hurricane season, especially in the areas of red. The only goal that I have is to really share my opinion of who is at higher risk this year in terms of getting impacts. And obviously, especially because this year is supposed to be a really active hurricane season, everybody's at some sort of heightened risk when it comes to impacts. Yes, I do acknowledge that that is the case. However, there's obviously always going to be areas that do get stronger storms compared to others, and this is just basically me giving my opinion on where those areas will be. And right away you could see the biggest area probably, in my opinion, this year will be the Caribbean. I've seen a lot of talks about the Caribbean getting a lot of activity, but I really do have a feeling, and I really do feel like people are going to be caught off guard in some way with the activity that we could see in the Caribbean this year. It always lines up, especially with La Nina years. We tend to get a lot of Caribbean activity. Even La Nina years going back to many years in the past, some of our worst storms happened in La Nina, and also in the late season too. 2020 as an example is the most recent example. 2020, we had a moderate La Nina by the time we got to the late season, and we had, what was it, five major hurricanes? Yeah, five major hurricanes, and literally three of them occurred in the Caribbean, of course, that being Delta, Eta, and Iota. And we could extend that further back to 2005. We had a weak La Nina. In the late season, we had Wilma, and also another year that a lot of people talk about, and is also in the analogs to the years that a lot of people are using when it comes to comparing this year to past years. 1998 as well. That was another very active season. It's also quite similar to this year in that it is a strong El Nino to strong La Nina transition year. That year had in the late season Hurricane Mitch, which is often a forgotten beast because it was a really bad storm for Central America. In fact, the highest storms in terms of deaths in a storm in the modern day satellite era. So there's another example for you. We also had storms like Lenny, a very strong hurricane in the Caribbean in the years just after 1998 and 1999. That was also a La Nina year. So the Caribbean is really at an impact, really at I'd say a ground zero, honestly. I guess that's the best way. I feel like that's the best way to really describe it, a ground zero for who will get impacts this year. I think everybody in the Caribbean islands, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Jamaica especially, and I think the highest area of concern besides the northern Gulf Coast this year, because the last 2 to 3 years we haven't gotten anything along the northern Gulf Coast, which is rightfully so, a much needed break, especially after 2020. And we also had a Hurricane Ida too. So the northern Gulf Coast very much deserved break, but I think that'll probably come to an end this year, especially in Texas and Louisiana. But besides that, the Yucatan probably the biggest area of concern as well this year. And then I have, of course, South Florida too, and the Bahamas. I think the Bahamas could get a lot this year as well. And I also have South Florida in a risk. Why do I not have the entire state of Florida under red? Some may be asking. And that is because simply everybody hypes up Florida every single year, especially, and I know because we've had Idalia and we've had Ian along the west coast of Florida, but the east coast, I'm specifically talking about the east coast of Florida, it is hyped every single year, and we really don't get much of anything at all along there. So I'm going to keep them in a moderate risk. And then I have, of course, the Delmarva Peninsula in a low risk. They don't really get much landfalls anyway. The Northeast, it is a little random. I know that we go from low risk in the Virginia Delmarva area to then a moderate risk along the Northeast. I believe, and it tends to happen from time to time, especially in these active seasons, something is able to sneak its way into the Northeast. And so I'm not ruling the chance out for that this year. And then, especially when it comes to Atlantic Canada, they've honestly been getting quite a bit recently, including Bermuda as well. They've been getting a lot when it comes to impacts, especially storms, long track MDR storms that would then recurve and become extratropical on its way to Atlantic Canada. They would often bring quite a bit in terms of impacts, and they've been getting a lot of that over the last few years, and I would not see how that will not change this year. So I do have them under risk as well. And of course, that is my landfall predictions summed up as a whole. So with that being said, I have my predictions down. What can we do to prepare, especially if you're in a high risk area, or at least in a high risk area that I view? What can you, and honestly, everybody, not just people in a high risk, but everybody along every single coastline this year, especially given that this year is expected to be an active hurricane season, what can you do to prepare? Because you could buy into all the hype that this season will be a record active hurricane season. This year will be really bad for everybody. You could buy into it, but at the end of the day, you could also be prepared, and you won't have to be scared because you'll be prepared. Kind of rhymes, doesn't it? But the bottom line that I'm trying to sell is that you should always be prepared. Hurricane Preparedness Week, National Hurricane Preparedness Week is coming up, and I will actually do another video based on preparations, and that is May 5th to May 11th. Um, as I suggest, buy supplies and put together a first aid kit well in advance. In fact, you should start right now. As soon as you click off this video, you should start getting together a hurricane preparedness kit. Even if you're along the coast, a certain part of the coastline in the United States or even in the Caribbean that is not very much anticipated for development this year, or you typically don't get impacts, you should prepare right now. You should start preparing right now. Some things that you should put in your first aid kit: a battery-powered radio to be able to listen to local information in case the power does go out in your area. Always check with your insurance, especially after Ian, because there was a huge disaster when it came to insurance and Hurricane Ian. So always make sure you check with your insurance to make sure that you will be covered. And if not, we'll get that sorted out, and get it sorted out right now, instead of having to deal with the storm, cause you a lot of heartache, only to then realize that you are not covered by insurance. So please keep that in mind this season as well. And obviously, remember your zone of evacuation, especially if you're right along the coastline, because you will need to know, of course, if a storm is headed right in your way, you should know, of course, are you the first in line to evacuate? So that is important. 4 of the most important things you should do right now in order to prepare. And you should start them right now as well. I strongly suggest that you do. Really quickly before we do go, naming lists when it comes to this year. This is the same naming list that we used in 2018, so the same list that had storms like Michael and Florence, although because they were really bad, they've been booted off the naming list this year, and they're replaced with Francine and Milton. But in the Atlantic, the first name for this year in the hurricane season is Alberto, followed by Beryl, and in the Eastern Pacific, we have Aletta, followed by Bud. So those are the first 2 names from the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific. And that is that when it comes to names. What about future forecasts? Because yes, I did release my first preliminary forecast today, but that does not mean that this is my last forecast I'll release for the hurricane season. I will have another forecast on June 1st, and I typically always do this in a live stream. I tend to do a live stream with a few other people that I'm in contact with, and we kind of do a day 1 get together for the hurricane season. And I will release my official hurricane season forecast then. And then August 1st, I typically don't do this date. I've skipped out this date every single year in the past, but I do plan to do it this year. I will do another mid-season forecast, kind of going over what we've had so far this hurricanes throughout the hurricane season leading up to August 1st, and I will make a prediction based on what we've had on what could be going forward into the hurricane season. So those are my dates, and that is it when it comes to predictions, though, for today, April 22nd. And that is that when it comes to today's prediction. And if you like what you saw today, I do encourage that you show support on YouTube by subscribing and liking and commenting and sharing with everybody that you know. And I'm also on Twitter too, or X. I still call it Twitter. I don't care for the other name. I'm also on Twitter too, and we just reached 100 followers today on Twitter. I greatly appreciate it, and I would appreciate if we get more followers as well. Help us grow the community. And I'm also on Discord too. You could get me at Danilo from NYC, exactly as it's written on here. If you want to ask any questions about what I think for the season or any specific stuff, you can message me. Or if you just want to say hi too, I don't mind. Message me on Discord as well, and I'll surely respond. Thanks again for watching. Stay safe, everybody. Peace, love, and kindness to all. And we will talk again very soon.